everybody here at the venue. Thanks for joining my talk. It's absolutely fantastic to be here in person here in Malaga. It has been an awesome conference so far, and I hope you enjoy my talk. So, about 23 years ago, when I started my career as a software engineer, there was a legend out there. A software engineer to whom we all looked up. And nowadays he is best known for creating Trello and Stack Overflow, so maybe you can already guess who that is. So it's Joe Spolsky. And back then he was best known for his blog. And his most famous blog post was Things You Should Never Do, Part 1. And actually I never figured out whether there's a Part 2, so maybe anybody of you know that or can remember. And in this blog post he mentioned the single worst strategic mistake a software company, organization, team, or developer can do. And that is to rewrite software from scratch. But that's exactly what we did. For the TOX test automation tool, a tool downloaded more than 12 million times a month, both heavily used in the open source community and by multi-billion-dollar companies alike. And today I want to tell you the story of TOX, and especially about the rewrite. You will learn about the reasons for the rewrite, the plannings, the ups and downs, and how we finally released it, and most important, you will learn more about us, the maintainers of the software. But first about me. My name is JürgenGmach. I'm a senior software engineer at Canonical. I work at the Launchpad team, so I take care of the build infrastructure for Ubuntu. So anytime you do a opt install or opt update on your Ubuntu machine, that will will flow through my little machines. Luckily, it's all automated, so I don't have to put a stamp on them. You can always reach out to me on Twitter or on Mastodon, and I also have a blog, but it's certainly not as famous as the one of Joe Spolsky. I'm one of the maintainers of TOX. I'm a fellow of the Python Software Foundation, and I live at the outer reach of the Bavarian Forest in Germany. And this is all possible because of the new remote work, or the new remote world. But actually, that's not new for Canonical. We are remote first and only for 19 years already, and I think we're doing that pretty good. And actually, we are also hiring at Canonical. You can work from anywhere on the world. And especially, Canonical is hiring in general, and also my team is hiring. So if you want to work with me, reach out to me. Either after the talk, or you can have a look at my website. We are looking for a couple of entry-level positions and mid-level positions, and also a manager. So back to TOX. So what is TOX? TOX is a test automation tool. What does that even mean? In order to explain that, we need to have a look how testing is usually done in Python. Usually you create a virtual environment, so you have some test isolation. Then you build the package, then you install the package, and then you install the test dependencies like PyTest and coverage and others, and then you run the tests. And this is, also maybe you have to run linters and build documentation, and this is only for your PC, only for one Python version, only for one framework version. And you have to do it all over for another Python version, for another framework version, and your colleagues have to also create all these steps and perform these steps. And also maybe you have to duplicate this in CI, also the same steps, and maybe you have some external contributors that also need to follow this tedious setup. So there must be a better way. And actually there is. You can install TOX, the library, which I will talking about. And with TOX, you create a configuration file. And as you can see in the env list, you just configure the Python versions you want to test against, because usually when you provide a library, you want to be compatible with a lot of Python versions, so users can use it. And then you define a test environment where you specify the test dependencies like PyTest, and then you name the command. And then the only thing you need to do is to install TOX. And usually I install TOX with pipx. Pipx is an awesome tool to install Python command line tools. And then you can run it. You can run it, your colleagues can run it. in CI, it can be run because this configuration file will be checked into your repository, so it's available for everyone, and no more manually filling around how to run the tests. And in order to understand the rewrite, we need to understand the roots of TOX. TOX was created by Holger Krickel already in 2010, and you may not be familiar with that name, but Holger not only created TOX, he also created PyTest, the most known Python test runner. He also created DevPy, which is basically for development similar to PyPy. And he also created PyPy, but that's not the package index, but the alternative Python implementation. And then a couple of years passed, like 7 years. TOX got very popular. Some even called it the standard in testing. And then Bernard Gabor joined the TOX team. Not because he wanted to become an open source maintainer, but out of necessity. He wanted to have some bugs fixed, and he wanted to contribute some new features. And soon he noticed that TOX was written with some specific assumptions. So it is only used to create Python environments, not a Conda environment or a Docker environment. It's only on your local system. It can only be configured with a TOX INI file and not with a Python file or a PyProject.toml file, which is the modern way now. You can only build source distributions and not a wheel. And the whole TOX INI, which I just showed, it was really little, but they can grow a lot, and it will always be evaluated at startup, so eagerly. So it can take quite a time when you have a very large TOX INI file, but for starting TOX, you only need some little informations. So what do you do when you join a project, an open source project, and you're not super happy with everything? Can anybody imagine? Bernard started rewriting the tool, the application TOX. But as you can see, it was a rewrite attempt, so he did not finish it. But he learned some valuable lessons of that. And soon afterwards, Holger Krickel left the project. He created TOX, but then at one point he left the project. And I think you should know and be aware that's a completely normal process. And that's something healthy even. It's, you know, you don't have to stick around once you create a project until the end of the life. Because maybe you choose another company, you have a different tech stack, you're no longer interested, maybe you have some life change of family or whatever. Nobody is obliged to maintain an open source library forever. And you know, I often get asked, like when I tell I'm a maintainer of TOX, oh, why did you create it and why did you name it TOX? It was not me. I joined much, much later, and that's an entirely healthy process. Soon afterwards, Bernard noticed a pattern in the bug reports for TOX. And actually, those bug reports were not for TOX, but for virtualenv, because TOX uses virtualenv in the background. And at that time, virtualenv was not really well maintained. Bernard fixed a couple of bugs, and eventually he became a maintainer of virtualenv. And what do you do when you become a maintainer of a new project? You rewrite it. So Bernard Gabor started rewriting virtualenv. And before I tell you how that went, I want to put everything here into perspective. So back then, in 2018, I was a contributor to the SOAP framework. SOAP is a very old and maybe the oldest Python web framework. And we have more than 300 repositories for libraries. And we wanted to migrate them from Python 2 to Python 3, which was very painful. And I was completely lost. There were so many projects, and I created a virtualenv for Python 2, a one for Python 3, and I copied back and forth code, and I ran tests here and there, and it was a complete mess. And so I asked the other maintainers, how do you handle this? This is so complicated. And they said, hey, we just use TOX. And that is the way how I came to the TOX project. And imagine I was basically working for more than 10 years as a professional software developer in the Python field, but I did not know about TOX. because I was working at a small company. So I think it's super important that you're here now and that you go to conferences and speak with others and learn about new toolings and new developments. And the resolution to the question, yeah, Bernard finished the rewrite of virtualenv, which is pretty scary, but because virtualenv is even more downloaded than talks, like 20 or 40 million times a month, and it was a big success. And he also created a talk about it. You should watch it because it's very insightful and entertaining and gives a lot of technical information about that. And soon after that, only 1 week, Bernard announced the talk's 2nd edition rewrite on Twitter. And a week later, or just a little bit later, he committed he created the first commit for the talk's rewrite. And then something special happened. Bernard started streaming the rewrite on Twitch. And I read about that on Twitter, and I joined the Twitch stream, and there were only like 2, 3, 4, 5 people, a little bit more, less than here, joining the transmission, the stream. And you have to imagine, back then, I was the only Python developer in a very small company with not much contact to the outside world, and this was so amazing. There was a super experienced Python developer rewriting a very popular tool from scratch, completely redesigning and sharing all his thoughts on live on stream about why does he do this design, why does it use this architecture. And this was so fascinating for me. I learned so much. And after that, I was completely sucked into talks. I was completely lost. So after that, I started answering talks questions on Stack Overflow. And you may wonder, how can I answer talks questions when I just started using it? But that's kind of way I like to learn. I try to help other people. So I have to read documentation, and then I helped answering other people's questions. And then I also created a talk, because back then I was super confused. How should I run my linters? I can run the linters on CLI on the terminal. I can use my IDE, like VS Code. I can use talks, certainly, because you can create different environments for testing and also for linters. And I can also use pre-commit. If you're developing in Python and you never heard of pre-commit, you should check it out. So I was confused. How would I do it? And then I sat down and I developed a strategy, and now it works out pretty well. That's the topic of a lightning talk, and which I gave at Python Ireland. And then I started also contributing to discussions and GitHub issues for talks. There were other people asking questions, and I tried to answer them. I also went through the backlog of the talks issue tracker. Maybe something was already fixed, or needs clarification, and I started doing that. And then Bernard announced talks 4 Alpha 2 and on Twitter. And he also asked the users to test it. So this was the first version you could use. And so I wanted to be a good citizen, and I tested it for my personal projects, and then also for my 10 or so work projects. And then I remembered, right, I'm also a maintainer of the SOAP repositories. We have 300 repositories, and all are using talks. So how could I test talks against 300 repositories? And because I don't want to do this manually, like I don't want to clone 300 repositories and run it, it would take forever. So I used another tool, it's called All Repos. And with this tool, you can basically clone a complete GitHub organization or repositories, and you can do also manipulations to them, like replace some config files or update config files and automatically create pull requests. That's pretty cool, but I was not able to run an arbitrary tool like talks against all the repositories. So I wrote a plugin for all repos, and then it worked out. And I tested against all 300 repositories with the new talks for alpha. And I did not say it was successful at the beginning. So it worked only for 22% of all the 300 repositories. And then I reached out to Bernard, and he had the perfect answer for that. So a 22% success here, that's not that great news. But on the plus side, if we fix SOAP, we are in a super position for the release. And I think this is the way, that you need some optimism about that. And at that time, we also got some feedback on Twitter, especially as Bernard announced that the plugin system for TOX 4 won't be compatible with the one of TOX 3. And people were not very happy about that. And back then, Oliver, who was also a maintainer, mentioned that are the people with the torches and the pickforge at the gate already and raging. And spoiler, they were not yet, but we will come to back that later. And then something nice happened. We got some positive feedback. Jürgen, who is usually at every conference, I don't know why she's missing here, she has to come next year definitely. She had a problem with TOX, and she created an issue on the tracker, and I answered it, and it was resolved. And I think that's something important. If you use open source software at home or at work, reach out to the maintainers. It's not only about funding and money and whatever. Just say hi and say, hey, you're doing a great job, I love your library, or whatever. That's means a lot to us, to the maintainers. Because usually, people only arrive and they create bug reports, and they want to have their 500 lines config file debugged for the multi-billion company, and I should do it in my spare time. So that's usually, so just say thank you. And then I created my first serious pull request against TOX. I was trying to fix the bugs I reported for SOAP and for the other projects. So I could give something back, because I really loved using TOX. And I was pretty busy doing a lot of pull request after pull request, and this went on for some time, and that's what's happening then. I was announced as a TOX maintainer by Bernard. And you can imagine that. That's an absolutely fantastic experience for me, because you know that tool, the tool which I loved, which is used all over the industry, and now I'm one of the maintainers. But only later I realized that it's a lot of work for free, but that's okay. And then I created another talk about how I tested the pre-release against the 300 Plone and SOAP repositories. And maybe you notice a pattern. I did this on purpose also, to spread the word about the rewrite, because we know that basically when you do a rewrite, some bad things will happen. And we wanted to know that the people, there is a rewrite and they should test it. And then Bernard also announced TOX 4 at PyCon US, we are lightning talk. And then life happened. It is now at the end of 2021, and we are in the rewrite for 1.5 years already. And people were already angry, and they wanted us to finish. But then Bernard moved to the US for a new job opportunity. And you don't move to the US in a weekend, so it takes some time. And I built a house for my family, which basically took a year. And I also joined Canonical, my employer. Oops. And you certainly, you could imagine that I wanted to put some effort in my new job. I wanted to do a good job, so there was not much spare time left. And we are now 1.5 years into the rewrite, and then we basically paused the rewrite for another year, because we are only 2 maintainers, we had no spare time, and that's how it went. And you can imagine that the people got really angry. And here we're back for the people with the torches and the pitchforks. And we got feedback like that. Just release it. That multi-year rewrite seems to never reach general availability. If it was a business, it would have been bankrupt for a long time ago. And at first I thought, oh man, such a... But then I thought, what about maybe they're right? Maybe they have reasons to be angry. And then again, Bernard stepped in and gave a great answer. Such a major release will ultimately break a lot of people. And we need maintainer availability to help those users and address their concerns. And I think that's an absolutely great answer. So it's about taking care of the users. So it's not about us, the maintainers. And then something remarkable happened, which I never experienced in my long career. We got a bug report about a vulnerable version of pylib. Pylib is a library we use for talks. And you need to know we only use it in talks 3. We will no longer use it in talks 4. And the vulnerability report was about the SVN module of pylib, and we don't use SVN. So, okay, there is something happening, but it's not really affecting us. But there are tools out there like pip audit and safety, and they check the open source supply chain. So basically, whenever anybody used talks for testing, and a lot of people use talks, the CI will break because of pip audit and safety. And usually that's certainly a good way to check your supply chain. What could we do? We did not have the time. We are still busy with moving and building house. And so for now, we recommended to whitelist this vulnerability because Tox is not using the SVN module. And that was, well, the people were not super happy, but it was a workaround. And then this was only step 1. This was not the end. So our friends from the PyTest project, they also got a bug report about the same library because PyTest is also using pylib. And they did something different to solve this problem. This was currently, they were on PyTest 6, and for PyTest 7, they vendored pylib. So basically, instead of installing it from PyPy, they took the library, put it inside the source code of PyTest, and stripped away the SVN module and everything they did not need. They only left there the modules they need for PyTest working. And this worked pretty well for PyTest, but you can imagine it's not the end. Because they rendered it in a very special way, and now the rendered pylib is shadowing the installed pylib. So whenever Tox tries to import from the installed pylib, it doesn't see it. It imports from the shadowed, from the rendered pylib. And Tox uses different parts of it. So it was broken because we got an import error. And now this was a serious mess for us because the combination of PyTest and Tox is super common. There are like millions of projects out there. And all were broken if they used PyTest 7. So what can we do now? We're still busy. And then something beautiful happened. Sorin Spanera is a longtime friend of the Tox project, and he's also a plugin author. And he announced that, hey, I'm available for 1 week, and I will work 1 week full on the Tox 4 release. And he wanted to help it to move it over the finish line. At the end, it maybe was not a full week, but it really gave a new momentum. He closed a lot of issues, and then we also stepped in a little bit in our spare time. And finally, fireworks, we released Tox 4, only 3 years later after we started the rewrite. And that was really a great relief for us, the maintainers, but also for our users. Then, can you imagine what happened after the release? We had lots and lots of regressions. We have lots of complaints, but we also had lots of contributions from more than 50 different contributors, and one of them even became a maintainer afterwards. And we have quite some praise, which was nice. So can you imagine, why did we have so many regressions? We took care, we announced it, and we took great care to not break anybody. We tested it against thousands of repositories. And the solution is basically Harem's law. And Harem's law says, with a sufficient number of users of an API, it does not matter what you promise in the contract, all observable behaviors of your system will depended on by somebody. So we received bug reports for things we did not even know Tox can do, although we were the maintainers for quite some time. But now we know about it. And at that time, I was a little bit frustrated because we put a lot of effort into it, and people got angry, and you have to imagine every time I contribute to talks, answer your tickets, work on your feature request or whatever, I take away time from my family and my kids. And still people got angry on me because we have not fixed one bug or there was one little regression. And at that time I read a blog post. It's called "I'm Not Your Supplier." And that blog post really resonated with me. It's about, we certainly don't want to break your CI system. We don't make bugs on purpose. It just happens. And we are not full-time employees of a TOX organization. It's done in our spare time, and sometime our company makes it available, able to work on that. And it's about anybody to use TOX or leave it. I have no contract with any of the users. And I don't want to bore you about the highlights of the TOX 4 release. But when you have a look at this list, you can recall that basically everything what Bernard identified as a problem at the beginning is what we achieved here with the rewrite. Now we can implement anything what is necessary for the future. It is more easy to maintain, and we are able to maintain it. And how was that possible? We used better abstractions. Before, we had like 1 to 3 huge files with mixed responsibilities, and it was very hard to extend. And now we have a config module for configuration management, execute module for command execution inside the environments, a Charla for recording the TOX sessions, a plugin submodule for the plugin management, and so on. And this was not completely clear from the beginning, but it evolved a little bit during the rewrite. And then afterwards we sat together and we talked about what went well and what we did well. So we have an automated test suite, but actually it did not cover everything, but that's a must nowadays. We announced it on every channel and every possible channel. We did a lot of talks, we wrote blog posts, we posted on Twitter, on Mastodon, on the Python forum, but don't think people really test pre-releases. A couple does, but most of the people don't care, and they cry when the next day when CI is broken. We sticked around after the release to help our users. We anticipated that there will be some issues after the release, and when the next day the CI breaks. We certainly kept the old documentation, because a lot of people just pin an older version and then upgrade it sometime later. And we kept the old development branch for TOX 3 to fix critical bugs. Although now TOX 3 is unmaintained. We only maintain the latest version. And yesterday I attended a talk about a colleague from the Free Software Foundation, and it was very interesting about how this will happen when there is when companies have to maintain like a router or a coffee machine for 10 years. Who is maintaining the software? Because I, as an open source maintainer, I only maintain the latest version. And then we also thought about what could have we done better. And this certainly looks odd or maybe arrogant or whatever, so let's rephrase it. What could have we done better given the resources? And well, we only had very, very restricted time, and I think it went pretty well. And there are also a couple of lessons learned. You need to have a plan, you need to test a lot, you need to be available post-release, you need to prepare for bug fixes in the coming months after the release, you need to be ready to re-evaluate everything from the ground up, and you need to be nice, but set boundaries to your users. And cheers to Joe Spolsky. I'm sorry, but legends are not always right, so the rewrite was a good decision. So thank you for attending my talk, and I'm here for any questions if you have. Thanks.
So what would be your advice for somebody who is
How to become a maintainer, or how to become? Well, you're already joined, and then how to? Well, I think you have done the biggest things, because once you're the maintainer, well, there are different things. You need to plan your time and think about how much commitment you want to put into that project, because for popular project it could be like your full-time job, but you usually don't get paid. Only a very few people get really paid for doing open source full-time. Well, except us, we also do open source full-time, but for a company. Talk with your employer. When you use the product at workplace, talk with them to give them like 10% or 20% time to work on this project, because your employer benefits from it. So it's a beneficial situation for both of you. Don't get sucked completely into it. Set boundaries. Don't spend too much time on it, and also set boundaries to your users, because they will demand anything, like new features, bug reports, and I reported it like 1 hour ago, why didn't you answer? And I need it until tomorrow because our multi-billion-dollar company CI is standing still and it's broken. You need to be nice, but set boundaries, and then I think that's really important. And enjoy it. I think it's an awesome opportunity to work together with world-class people from around the world, which I had no chance before when I was working at my very small company. And I think maybe contributing to talks and maintaining talks was also a step in my career, which led me to work at Canonical. The company is doing Ubuntu, which is basically known all over the world. And I think that helped me when I applied back then. Could you come? Just come here. Come. Do we have a microphone? Maybe not. Come closer, so everybody hears it. Okay.
I would like to know about the evolution that will be the tool in the following years. Also, I'd like to ask about the support with continuous integration, continuous delivery tools like GitLab, Jenkins, and so on.
Okay, let's answer the second question first. Maybe you need to repeat the first one. So the integration with CI systems is pretty easy and straightforward, because you have this tox configuration file, which defines all the tests you need to run, and maybe the documentation, and also running linters and whatever, and you just need to install tox. So you install tox locally on your PC, and then you can run all the tests, and you also have to only install tox in your CI. And it doesn't matter whether it's GitHub, it's GitLab, it's Jenkins, it's Launchpad CI, which we created at Canonical. It does not really matter. You need to provide maybe system packages, and you also need to provide the Python versions, because tox cannot install the Python versions. They need to be installed on the system. So I'm not super familiar with GitLab. I was using GitHub a lot. You just create a configuration file. You need to install these Python versions, and then you just run tox. If you run tox with no parameters, it runs all the listed environments in your env list, and that's the way to go. You can optimize a little bit to fail fast or whatever, or that's up to you, but that's the thing. Maybe you can repeat the first question?
What do you think can be the evolution of the tool in the following years?
Okay. Actually, this is an interesting question. When I spoke with Bernard, or basically, my thing is like, it's very stable now. It's working great. So I don't see many things to change. I like it how it is, and it's working great. And it's very extensible. We have the good abstractions, and we also have a plugin system. So when somebody comes to us and I need to do this and that, we try to avoid to put it in Tox core, because this means a lot of additional burden, maintainership burden, and we usually tell them to create a plugin, and let's see how it works, and maybe if the plugin is super popular, we can put it into Tox core at one point. The other maintainer, Bernard, has a little bit has different views on the future. He wants to do some more things, but I think most of the people don't care much about new features. They want to have a stable system. They want to focus on their business logic and their project, and not like updating CI because it was broken because of something. So Bernard has a vision of having a Python configuration file for Tox, similar to Nox, which is another project. We are not competitors. We are friends, and that's his vision. But I think it will. I'm not super happy about that, because I think following the Python mantra or the Linux mantra, like doing one thing and doing one thing great, is good. Why should we have two configuration files? And it's not easy, because you can do many more things with Python itself instead of with an INI file, which is restricted from the logic. So it's not easy to be compatible. That's the thing. For now, the rewrite is done. The waves have settled. We got quite some bug reports, but all the critical ones are fixed, and I'm happy to go forward, but more slowly. So let's see.
Do you have any big technical debt on Tox that you want to take care of?
Not anymore. That was done with the rewrite. It was completely designed from scratch. We had quite some technical depths about, when I mentioned that it was very hard to do something different, like create wheels instead of source distributions, or if you wanted to test against Docker and not a virtual env, and now you can do anything about that. So no, luckily that's we are in that position, and that is when you do a greenfield project or a rewrite, there's basically no technical depth about it, and that it has a price, but it worked out for us. And now it's much more fun to contribute, because it's easier to contribute, and it's also an invitation for everybody. If you want to have a look, Tox is certainly not a super easy and beginner-friendly project, but it's okay, and it's easier now, and you can always have a look at the issues. But if you intend to join a project or do something about it, my first thing is always use the documentation and the tutorials and try the tool. So maybe there are some rough edges which we don't see, because we use it for many, many years, and most of the users are just used to it. But with fresh eyes, maybe the documentation is a little outdated, or maybe some edge cases are missing or something like that. And this is usually how I start contributing to new projects. Maybe I need to use a library for work. I try the tutorial and say, oh, okay, this is outdated. I create a pull request, and that way I created or contributed to, like, I think hundreds of projects. And it's not like, oh my God, what did you do? But it's just, I think it's the usual way, and I think it's the way it should be, that you give something back and not only use the projects. Yeah.
I have a question about the packages in the Ubuntu repositories. I don't know if Tox is part of them, but I know that usually there's some differences between the packages that you install from IPI
Yeah.
and the ones that you install from the Ubuntu repositories.
Yeah.
Do you have any word on them, any recommendations?
Right.
And also, I would like to know if the packages in the Ubuntu repositories are usually built by the Tox maintainers, if you have one there.
That's a good question. So the easiest question is, like, we don't build upstream packages, because there are just too many distributions. There's Ubuntu, Debian, Arch, Nixos, whatever, and that's not our thing. So there are usually other people taking upstream projects and package them for Ubuntu or for any other distributions, and they take also care of security fixes and all the thing, and they maintain it. Canonical just recently launched Ubuntu Pro. You can install it for free for 5 workstations, and you get security support, I think, not only for 5 years, which was usual for LTS releases, but for 10 years. And that's a good way if you're a company, you want to have some stable things and whatever. The thing is, certainly, we are only like 2 or 3 people. We cannot and we don't want to give support for older packages. We support tox 4. Whatever is currently the latest version. And sometimes we get bug reports for, oh, in this version 3.2.1, there's something broken. And we say, then just try it with tox 4. If it is still broken, we try to help you. If it's not, talk with our colleagues or whoever packages that for Ubuntu or for Arch or something like that. And my recommendation is for these tools, use pipx. Pipx is basically you can install any packages from PyPI. It automatically creates a virtual environment and it puts it on your path. So you can always use the latest version. You can easily update all installed packages whenever you want, and that's the way. I would not use system packages for that thing, except you have some company decisions or whatever, and everybody. The one advantage I see is that everybody would have the same version, because it's always a little bit difficult. But for talks, we try to stay compatible. Thanks.
You mentioned a tool to handle a lot of repositories and different changes.
Yeah.
Can you tell the name of it?
It's all repos, ALL-repos. And it's written by Anthony Sotile. Anthony Sotile is pretty much known in the Python industry or in the Python community. He created or he maintains Flake 8. He was, and is maybe still, a friend of Tox and a maintainer of Tox. He also created pre-commit and or repos and PyUpgrade, where you can upgrade all your code to the latest Python version. So he's super proliferant, and he's creating tons of tools, and that's one. I also created a blog post about how to use all repos. You can do a lot of things with it, like cloning all repositories, update the configuration file, and then even create pull requests. And that's pretty cool, like when I did it and created like 300 pull requests.
Yeah, my problem is that I have a pre-commit file, and I have a lot of repositories, and I need to update.
That's exactly the use case for it, yeah. Or your other projects hosted on GitHub. Yeah. There's also pre-commit CI, .ci, and this is basically a plugin for GitHub or a service for GitHub, and it automatically creates updates for pre-commit every week. That's also something you can use.